getting close to your 40th birthday. How is it the way you feel about music?
I did not circle that question.
Michael Jackson once did something so audacious that even the man he outmaneuvered, a former songwriting partner and friend, could barely bring himself to discuss it in later years. Before the world knew the full story, all it saw was a headline. The king of pop had quietly acquired the rights to hundreds of Beatles songs written by two of his own idols. No dramatic confrontation, no public feud, just a business decision that stunned the music industry overnight. That single moment would come to define something the public rarely associated with Jackson's soft-spoken, almost childlike public persona, a ruthless, calculating instinct that surfaced only when it mattered most. This is not a story about scandal or tabloid gossip. It is a story about the moments when the gentlest performer on earth revealed a spine of steel, and how those flashes of sharpness shaped both his empire and his image. To understand how Michael Jackson became capable of such calculated moves, it helps to look back at where his hardness was first forged. Long before Thriller, before the moonwalk, before the world watched a boy become a phenomenon, Jackson was a child performer under intense pressure, groomed by an industry that demanded perfection and punished hesitation. By his teenage years, he had already lived through the internal politics of Motown, a label built on discipline, image control, and relentless competition among its own artists. It was there that Jackson learned an early hard lesson: talent alone does not guarantee power. Ownership does. That lesson would follow him for the rest of his life, quietly shaping decisions that often looked impulsive to outsiders but were, in reality, deeply strategic. By the early 1980s, Jackson was no longer merely a pop star. He was becoming a businessman with instincts sharper than many executives around him. His decision to purchase ATV Music Publishing in 1985, which held the rights to the majority of the Beatles' catalog, remains one of the most talked-about maneuvers in music history. Paul McCartney had reportedly encouraged Jackson years earlier to invest in music publishing, unaware that Jackson would eventually outbid him for the very catalog McCartney hoped to reclaim. There was no malice publicly recorded in this act, no confrontation caught on camera, yet the symbolism was undeniable. Jackson had taken something deeply personal to one of his mentors and turned it into one of the most valuable assets in entertainment history. It was not cruelty. It was calculation, precise and unsentimental, revealing a side of Jackson that rarely made headlines but quietly dictated the terms of his career. This same sharpness appeared again and again, often disguised as charm. During press conferences, Jackson could deflect intrusive or hostile questions with a calm, almost serene detachment that left journalists visibly unsettled. Where other celebrities might snap or storm off, Jackson would simply smile, pause, and respond in a manner so composed it became its own kind of power move. Biographers have noted that this control was not accidental. Jackson understood image as currency long before social media made personal branding an industry unto itself. Every carefully measured response, every calculated silence, was part of a larger performance, one where vulnerability and toughness existed in the same breath. Nowhere was this duality more evident than in his interactions with the media, surrounding his changing appearance and the tabloid obsession with his private life. Rather than avoiding the subject entirely, Jackson occasionally addressed it with unexpected directness. In interviews such as his 1993 conversation with Oprah Winfrey, he spoke candidly, at times with startling honesty about his childhood, his skin condition, and the years of ridicule he endured from tabloids that mocked his physical transformation. What could have been a moment of pure defensiveness instead became one of controlled vulnerability, delivered with precision. It was savage in its own quiet way. Jackson took control of a narrative that had for years controlled him. His business instincts extended into the way he handled contracts and negotiations throughout his career. Executives who once believed they held leverage over him often discovered otherwise. Reports from industry insiders and documented label negotiations reveal a man who understood his own worth long before the industry was willing to admit it. When Sony sought greater control over his master recordings in the years following the bad era, Jackson resisted with a tenacity that surprised many who assumed his gentle public image reflected passivity in business as well. He fought for ownership, control, and creative independence at a time when few black artists in the industry were afforded such power, a fact historians and music scholars have pointed to as part of his broader, often overlooked legacy. On stage, Jackson's sharper instincts translated into spectacle and command. His 1995 MTV Video Music Awards performance of They Don't Care About Us stunned audiences with its raw intensity, drawing criticism from some corners for lyrics interpreted as provocative, while others saw it as a direct commentary on prejudice, injustice, and the treatment he had personally experienced. Jackson later clarified in public statements that the song was meant to condemn racism and bigotry, not to promote it, showing once again his willingness to confront controversy directly rather than retreat from it. It was a moment that revealed his complexity, an artist capable of profound tenderness in songs like Man in the Mirror, yet unafraid to channel anger and defiance when he felt wronged by public perception. His rivalry, real or exaggerated by the press, with other major stars of his era also revealed glimpses of quiet competitiveness. Jackson rarely engaged directly in public feuds, but his responses, when they came, were memorable for their restraint laced with unmistakable confidence. When compared publicly to contemporaries like Prince, a rivalry largely constructed and amplified by media outlets rather than either artist, Jackson's demeanor remained composed, yet those close to him described a competitive fire that fueled his relentless perfectionism in the studio. This drive pushed him to re-record vocals dozens of times, reject finished tracks that did not meet his exacting standards, and demand excellence from collaborators, a side of his personality music producers like Quincy Jones have spoken about in documented interviews and biographical accounts. Jackson's sharpness was not limited to business or performance. It extended into how he handled legal battles. Throughout his life, he faced numerous lawsuits, some settled out of court, others fought publicly with fierce legal representation. Rather than shying away from confrontation in these moments, Jackson's legal teams pursued aggressive defense strategies, reflecting an artist who understood the stakes of his public image and was willing to fight fiercely to protect it. Whether one views these battles sympathetically or skeptically, they undeniably show a man who did not simply absorb blows passively. He responded, strategically and forcefully, often reshaping public narratives through carefully timed statements, television specials, and documentary rebuttals. Even Jackson's philanthropic efforts carried an edge of quiet defiance against a media landscape that often refused to acknowledge his generosity. His charitable contributions, verified through organizations, and the Guinness World Records recognition he received for the most charities supported by a pop star, stood in stark contrast to the tabloid caricatures that dominated headlines for decades. In interviews, Jackson expressed visible frustration, though rarely anger, at the disconnect between his private actions and his public perception. This tension between the man who quietly funded hospitals and children's charities and the exaggerated tabloid figure constructed by decades of sensationalism remains one of the most fascinating contradictions of his public life. As the years passed, Jackson's sharper moments became harder to separate from the mythology surrounding him. Documentaries, biographies, and retrospectives have attempted to reconcile the gentle, almost otherworldly persona he presented on stage with the fiercely guarded, strategically minded individual operating behind the scenes. Authors such as J. Randy Taraborelli, whose extensive biographies remain among the most cited sources on Jackson's life, describe a man whose softness was genuine, but whose survival instincts, honed since childhood, never fully disappeared. This duality is perhaps what made him such a compelling and complicated figure, an artist who could bring an audience to tears with a single note, yet who understood the cold mechanics of business and image control well enough to outmaneuver seasoned executives twice his age. What emerges from these moments is not a portrait of cruelty, but of resilience shaped into sharpness. Jackson's most savage instincts were rarely about vengeance. They were about control, precision, and self-preservation in an industry that had exploited him since childhood. Every calculated business decision, every composed response to hostile media, every fierce defense of his creative and financial interests, reflected a man determined never again to be powerless in the way he once was as a child performer. In this light, his sharper moments become less about savagery in the conventional sense and more about survival, executed with a discipline that few could match. In the end, Michael Jackson's legacy remains a study in contrasts, a man capable of extraordinary tenderness and extraordinary toughness within the same lifetime. His story reminds us that public figures are rarely as simple as the images we construct of them, and that beneath the soft-spoken voice and gentle stage presence was someone who understood, perhaps better than most, that survival in the spotlight required more than talent. It required will. And in the quiet moments when Jackson chose to assert that will, whether in a boardroom, an interview chair, or beneath the lights of a sold-out arena, he revealed a complexity that continues to shape how the world remembers him today.